This video is going to look at the relationship between fractions, decimals and percentages. To illustrate, we've got an example here. In a garden there are 100 tulips. 75 of them are red. That means 75 out of 100 tulips are red, and we can write that in three different ways. We can write it as a fraction here, so we've got 75 out of 100, 75 over 100. We can write it as a decimal, 0.75. This, of course, is the decimal equivalent because this means 75 divided by 100, which is 0.75. We can also write it as a percentage. 75 out of 100 means 75%. We can turn a decimal into a percentage by multiplying it by 100, and 0.75 times 100 gives us 75%. So this is just three different ways of saying exactly the same thing. So we're going to work through some examples of changing fractions into decimals and percentages. So if I have the fraction 8/10, this is easily written as a decimal, 0.8. We've got 8 in the tenths position. To turn it into a percentage, I need to make that into a fraction over 100. So in this case, both parts have been multiplied by 10. I've got 80 out of 100, 80%. If I start with a percentage, 42%, I divide it by 100 to write it as a decimal, 0.42. Remember, a percentage is out of 100. 100% means one whole. So a percentage is always going to be 0 point something unless the percentage is greater than 100. 42% is 42 out of 100. We can simplify that to 21 over 50. That's the simplest terms we can get that particular percentage into. If I start with a decimal, I've got 0.75. So I multiply by 100, I've got 75%. 0.75 is, of course, 7/10, 5/100, 75 hundredths, 75 over 100. And this simplifies down to 3/4. We divide both parts by 25, and it's 3/4 in its simplest term. These particular equivalencies are something you really need to know by heart, the same as you need to know 1/2 is 50% and 0.5, and 1/4 is 0.25 and 25%. So let's just go over the three different methods. So method number one, I make it into an equivalent fraction over 100. So I've got 3/5. This has to be multiplied by 20, so the numerator does as well. 60 over 100, 60%. Method two, I can multiply the fraction by 100%. So we looked at this in our video about multiplying by whole numbers. So 3/5 multiplied by 100 over 1. The 5 and the 100 cancel down. They both divide by 5. So 5s into 5 go once, and into 100 go 20. And I'm left with 3 times 20 over 1, which is, of course, 60%. The third method is I can change my fraction into a decimal, which, as you remember, you do by dividing it out. So 3 divided by 5, which gives us 0.6, which I've written very badly. And then we multiply the decimal by 100. 0.6 multiplied by 100, 60%. Let's have a look at an example. 3 over 25, 3/25. Method one, making into an equivalent fraction over 100. This is a nice easy one. 25 multiplied by 4 is 100. So I just multiply the numerator by 4. 12 over 100, 12%. Method two, multiplying by 100. Again, this was nice and easy. The 25 and the 100 both cancel down. They divide by 25, so we get a 1 down here and a 4 at the top. We end up with 12 over 1, 12%. Method three, we're dividing it out, the fraction, to make a decimal. I have done this here in writing. To be honest, I wouldn't do it this way. If I was going to do it like that, I'd use a calculator. And if I had a calculator, I would use the calculator to do the percentage rather than going through the different operations. but this is basically what your calculator does when you press the percentage button. It divides out your fraction and it multiplies the decimal by 100. So 23 divided by 25 gives us 0.12 multiplied by 100, 12%. So this one, I'd only use it really if I already knew what that fraction was as a decimal. If I have to start dividing it, I'm less likely to use it. 3/8. This time, method 1, making it into a fraction over 100, isn't going to work. 8 isn't a factor over 100. I could make it into a fraction over 1,000, but to be honest, I'm not going to bother. So method 2, I'm going to multiply the fraction by 100. Again, the 8 and the 100 will cancel down. They both divide by 4. 8 divided by 4 is 2. 100 divided by 4 is 25. 3 times 25 is 75. 2 multiplied by 1 is 2. 75 divided by 2, 37.5, 37.5%. Method 3, again, we're into lots of division calculations that you don't really want to be going through. But if you do, 3 divided by 8 will give you 0.375, and you multiply that by 100 and you get 37.5%. If you're going to do the division method, you're going to have to go at least to 3 decimal places to find out where it ends. So you might have to round your decimal into an approximate percentage. Sometimes you're going to get a fraction where the denominator is actually greater than 100. And in this case, we need to cancel it down. We need to simplify the fraction down to a fraction of 100. So to make it into a fraction over 100, we need to divide both of these by 6. And we end up with 60 over 100, 60%. I can multiply by 100 again, so I've got 360 over 600 multiplied by 100 over 1. These cancel down, they both divide by 100, so this becomes 1, this becomes 6. And I end up with 360 over 6. Divide it out, I get 60%. If I want to do the division method to go through a decimal, I would simplify down to 36 over 6 I know is 6. So I know 360 divided by 6 is 60. So 360 divided by 600 will be 100 times smaller than that, 0.06. And as you've guessed it, at this point, it's a bit of a waste because I'm going to multiply that back by 100 again to get to 60%. 9 times out of 10, method 2 is going to be the simplest method to use. If it's easy to convert it to a fraction over 100, do that one. I'd save making it into a decimal for when you need to use a calculator. There you go.